Hello and welcome to this overview of Chinese Shakespeares. I just want to note that this video essay only covers mainland examples. Hong Kong and Singapore each have a rich relationship with Shakespeare and are a huge part of Sinophone Shakespeare studies, but their respective post-colonial histories will require too much time for me to cover in depth here. Most of the examples that I'll be discussing are from either Beijing or Shanghai, with the only exceptions coming from elsewhere in the mainland. The history of Chinese Shakespeare starts in the 19th century when Chinese reformers used Shakespeare's name for various agendas. In 1839, the first mention of Shakespeare in Chinese was by Lin Zexu in Annals of the Four Continents. Lin was among those who attempted and failed to stop the opium trade in China. He threw large amounts of opium from foreign ships into the sea, as depicted in this famous painting. His motive was to resist European powers, to know thy enemy at the start of the First Opium War, and so the first mention of Shakespeare in Chinese simply describes him as prolific, followed by a description of the British as greedy, tough, alcoholic, yet skillful in handicraft. Chinese defeat in the First Opium War and First Sino-Japanese War and the failure of the Hundred Days Reform in 1898 were a shock to the late Qing dynasty's intelligentsia, who focused on what old China lacked in comparison to the industrialized West and Japan. Japan had only recently emerged as a threat to China. Chinese reformers saw that to strengthen itself, it would have to follow in Japan's footsteps and appropriate Western ideas, not simply import Western technologies or material culture. So in the 1860s, the imperial government established an official institution to translate Anglo-European works on geography, travel, political philosophy, literature, and general Western knowledge. Without any problematic effort to encourage the study of these texts, the knowledge spread across various social classes. In 1877, Shakespeare was first introduced into the university curriculum in China. In 1902, the leading scholar Liang Qichao argued that the best way to educate new citizens was to introduce European literature to China, including Shakespeare and science fiction. Liang coined the standard transliteration of Shakespeare's name into Chinese, Shakespeare, which is still used today. There was already a long tradition of fascination with new and foreign culture and consumer products, so there was a pre-existing framework for Chinese writers to appropriate non-Chinese texts. However, in the late 19th century, Western exoticism was tied to the rise of Western enclaves in Chinese urban centres, so there were mixed feelings regarding the interest in these commodities. However, Shakespeare's universality, which was therefore seen as neutrality, became the prevalent association which helped to overcome the contradiction between resisting British invasion and celebrating its iconic national poet. The underlying idea that he could provide a new mode of thinking for China remained. We do know what some early Chinese audiences thought of Shakespeare. In 1879, China's first minister to England, Guo Songtao, attended Henry Irving's Hamlet in London. His account shows an interest in the plot rather than language, style, or character's psyche, as did other Chinese elites who saw performances of Shakespeare's plays around this time. But Alexa Joubon finds that the emphasis on the plot is reminiscent of Lord George Macartney's reaction to Chinese performance in 1793, which also focused on plot. As she identifies, it seems that this fixation on plot is symptomatic of preliminary stages of cross-cultural encounters, not just from the Chinese side. Guo's diary containing his description was published in 1882 and read as a report on life in England, representing another example of the interest in the West at this time. The first translation of Shakespeare into Chinese was in 1904, but not as drama as bedtime stories instead. Lin Shu translated the Lamb's Tales from Shakespeare into Chinese from the Japanese, which had been published in the 1870s. The stories were shorter, cheaper to publish, and more straightforward to translate than Renaissance play texts, and became enormously popular worldwide, especially in Asia. Although they were heavily edited, they helped Shakespeare become a globally recognised name. Lin's introduction emphasised Shakespeare's status as a global icon, with a clear subtext. Shakespeare was already the world's poet, and not long overdue in China. In recognition of its novelty, the publishers proudly called the book Strange Tales from Overseas. It sold so well that it was reprinted 11 times in the next 3 decades. Lin later rendered the complete set of short stories into semi-classical Chinese in an English poet reciting from afar on joyous occasions. Lin's introduction for that collection went to some trouble to explain that despite his title, these Shakespearean tales were an excellent match for Chinese sensibilities, where fantastical stories of gods and spirits were established genre fiction already. Here he aimed to make ancient Chinese culture equal to the best from the West. In 1916, Lynn released another batch of tales, this time the ones the Lambs had ignored, the Roman and history plays. Lynn's translations recalibrated the text for Chinese consumers. For example, Hamlet became a Confucian parable on the importance of filial duty and respect. Others were adjusted to make them resemble popular Qing-era love stories. Because of Lynn's work, a mass readership was devouring the stories of Shakespeare. These versions are still popular in the 21st century. New editions of the Lamb's translation were published in 2004 and 2008. If you're interested in the meanings of the titles' translations into Chinese, I'm making a video on that topic where I talk more about Lynn's work. I'm going to give an overview of some firsts that took place during the Republic era, which lasted from 1912 to 1949. There aren't many visual resources for these events, but it's worth noting that in 1913, the Shanghai Eastern Girls' School performed the first Chinese-language Huaju spoken drama, Shakespeare. These photos aren't of that performance or even from that era, but show examples of Huaju staging. The school performed The Woman Lawyer from Bao Qianshao's translation of The Merchant of Venice. Also in 1913, an adaptation called Bond of Flesh, based on Lynn's version of The Merchant of Venice, was acted by the National Renewal Society of Shanghai. It was a box office hit and sparked a fashion for Shakespearean dramas, both comedies and tragedies, notably Othello, Romeo and Juliet, Hamlet, Much Ado About Nothing, and The Taming of the Shrew. In 1914, the Ya'an Sichuan Opera Theatre performed the first Chinese opera version of Shakespeare when they performed Hamlet. Again, these photos are just to show examples of Jinju Hamlet staging. They are from The Revenge of Prince Sidan, videos of which are available on YouTube. I plan on making a separate video on Chinese theatrical traditions, but to give an idea of the scope of the history, here's a quick overview. By the Shan Dynasty, hunting rituals had become codified into dances and performances. Around the start of the Shan Dynasty, mammoths went extinct worldwide. By the time of the Zhou Dynasty, which covered the eras of Buddha, Plato, Aristotle and Socrates, the performances had become chorus dances. Grand spectacles known as Bai Shi, 100 entertainments, became popular at the imperial court, a smorgasbord of music, miming, magic, martial arts and dancing. Many of these forms are preserved in Chinese opera. However, during the Republic era, reformers argued that the strict refinements of Jinju meant that it couldn't communicate genuine dramatic truth, and that Chinese literature should open itself to outside influences. This shaped the fledgling form known as Huaju, which, as we've seen, was already being used to play Shakespeare, so I'm kind of talking about these the wrong way around. Jinju, that is Chinese opera, reigned supreme in Beijing, but in cosmopolitan Shanghai, which was more exposed to imported cinema and drama, Huaju thrived. We've seen examples of that with the two Merchant of Venice adaptations from 1913, both being held in Shanghai. There had not been a complete translation of a Shakespeare play until 1921, when Tian Han published his translation of Hamlet. This was so successful that something of a translation boom followed, with versions of the plays already familiar to Chinese readers, such as The Merchant of Venice, The Taming of the Shrew, As You Like It, and The Merry Wives of Windsor, all being redone in the late 1920s, this time with reference to Shakespeare's texts. In 1927 came the first cinematic Shakespeare adaptation in Chinese, a silent film adapted from The Merchant of Venice, again called The Woman Lawyer. I can't find any footage of this, unfortunately. The first Chinese professional staging of a full Shakespeare play was by the Shanghai Drama Assembly in 1930. They performed The Merchant of Venice. The show ran for 2 seasons and was acclaimed for the lavish accuracy costumes, which set a lasting trend in China for Shakespeare in what the theatre historian Li Ruwu calls the original source. Shakespeare was, and perhaps still is, seen as a distinctly foreign writer who showed tantalising glimpses of exotic, distant lands. You may have noticed the prevalence of The Merchant of Venice among these adaptations. It's staged far more in China than Britain, but why? Andrew Dixon thinks it is because Venice represented global trade during Shakespeare's time, as Shanghai did in the early 20th century, so the mixing pot society in the play probably reminded Shanghainese audiences of Shanghai. This was partly due to Shanghai being one of the 5 treaty ports established by the British following the First Opium War. Before 1912, there was a population of up to 25,000 Jewish people in Shanghai, so the Jewish element of the plot may have had some familiarity. However, as I'll discuss later, Marxist readings of the plays became the standard understanding of Shakespeare after the Communist Revolution, so the fact that The Merchant of Venice is so concerned with money is the main contributing factor in its popularity. A version you can actually find very easily is the 1931 silent film adaptation of The Two Gentlemen of Verona called A Spray of Plum Blossom. The film is imaginatively relocated to contemporary Shanghai and Guangzhou and depicts two strong-willed modern women as they journey in search of their wayward men. In one daring scene, Sylvia, played by the huge movie star Lin Chu, even dons uniform, having supplanted the Valentine character as the chief of military police. From the late 1930s onwards, however, theatre was strictly curtailed, first by the war with the Japanese and then by the conflict between the nationalists and the communists. During this time, Zhu Shenghao famously worked on translating the complete Shakespeare plays. His work was destroyed when fleeing the Japanese. He then retranslated the texts he'd done, only to have them destroyed again in December 1941 when Japanese forces swept into the international settlement. He translated the works again in the last months of his life, although they would not be published until after his death in 1954. 7 decades on, his versions are still regarded as favourites, endlessly praised for their poetic and timelessly Chinese qualities. Zhu's story is reported in most works on Chinese Shakespeare and is often recirculated by the domestic media. Probably because the story has a strong sense of nationalism, Zhu had been a passionate patriot, and he was working in an especially emotive time in China's history. Andrew Dickson works out that Zhu's versions of Shakespeare have sold millions of copies, which means he's probably the world's most read Shakespearean translator in any language. However, as Zhu translated using reference books and was not fluent in English himself, some of the translations are creative or just wrong. Still, since his translations were the first to reach a mass audience in China and were so popular, even some scholars favour them over later, more faithful translations, even now. Also, interestingly, Dickson highlights the role of Zhu's wife, Qingru, a talented linguist and published poet. He has a hunch that anyone doing detailed research into the translations credited to Zhu would find Qingru's fingerprints all over them. In any case, she kept the manuscripts safe during the Communist Revolution, as they would have been destroyed if not hidden, so either way she had a huge role. We see that Shakespeare experienced an astonishing boom in popularity in the years after the 1949 revolution. He was rubber-stamped by Marx, a model bardolatrous German with reverence for Shakespeare, who had quoted Timon of Athens' denunciation of gold in Das Kapital and thereby made Shakespeare famous among communist intellectuals. He was swooned over by Russian academics such as the Soviet technicians, including theatre directors and literature professors, sent to help Chinese industries and universities modernize. In Russia, Shakespeare had been revered since the 18th century, and now China copied its elder brother. Marxist books and essays on Shakespeare were translated and placed on curriculums. This is when Zhu Shenghao's translations were published posthumously in 12 volumes in 1954, 300,000 copies sold by the early 1960s. Perhaps another 200,000 copies of individual plays entered circulation. Mao was eager to revive Chinese culture and diverted state resources to set up drama schools and troupes. Perhaps 160 companies came into being in the first decades of the People's Republic, with Shakespeare and other Western dramatists providing the core of the repertoire. Courtesy of the cosy relationship with Russia, Shakespeare also began to appear on Chinese movie screens, with nationwide screenings of Sergei Yukovich's Othello and Laurence Olivier's Hamlet and Richard III. When Andrew Dickson visited China, he found that many people, especially those over the age of 50, still spoke of Olivier in honoured terms. At this time, Shakespeare's plays were studied in dialectical terms, looking for examples of class conflict, partly due to those Marxist books and essays on the curriculums that I mentioned. For example, Hamlet became not a study in savage introspection but a social tragedy whose hero's solemn duty is to free the lumpen proletariat. Romeo and Juliet became a reflection of the desire of the bourgeois class to shake off the yoke of the feudal ethic code. Othello was staged as a tragedy of class rather than race. As a result, Timon of Athens is read and keenly debated in China, one of the only countries in the world to do so. This period ended when the Cultural Revolution started in Shanghai in August 1966. Shakespeare was suddenly regarded as an anti-revolutionary capitalist influence. Among millions of books, the Shanghai Theatre Academy's historic copy of Ro Chuan, Lin Shu's early version of The Merchant of Venice, was consumed by flames. Xian Han, the revered playwright who had translated Hamlet as an honour to his country, was denounced as a bourgeois revolutionary and tortured. In 1964, a movement had begun for so-called revolutionary operas, which junked the emperors, kings, generals, chancellors, maidens and beauties of traditional Jingju. replacing them with stories that venerated the People's Liberation Army, the stout courage of the masses, and Mao himself. Titles like Taking Tiger Mountain by Strategy, The Red Detachment of Women, and Raid on the White Tiger Regiment displaced everything else from Chinese stages for the entirety of the Cultural Revolution. Andrew Dixon finds that within hours of the ban on Shakespeare ending at the end of the Cultural Revolution, people had queued around the block to buy copies of the plays. In 1978, China entered the reform era, led by the new premier Deng Xiaoping. This opened China up to the rest of the world. Shakespeare was now seen as a symbol of openness and internationalism. China was to revere him and Zhu Shenghao, whose work had had to be hidden only 30 years earlier. As a symbol of this new attitude, in 1984 the Shakespeare Society of China was founded, followed 2 years later by the first Shakespeare Festival in China, launched simultaneously in Beijing and Shanghai on the 10th of April. A second festival followed in 1994 in Shanghai. I would be amiss not to mention one of the best-known modern Chinese directors of Shakespeare. In 1989, Lin Zhaohua famously directed Hamlet at the Beijing People's Art Theatre, a video of which is available in the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive and the MIT Global Shakespeares Archive. Hamlet is played by 3 different actors, with the message being that we all have the potential to be Hamlet. In 2001, Lin's Richard III was commissioned by a Berlin festival. This version cites the 1995 film of Richard III starring Ian McKellen, among other references, and sometimes leans into parody. This performance is also available on the Asian Shakespeare Intercultural Archive. Lin is an avant-garde director and commonly described as controversial. In his Hamlet, Lin references the Tiananmen massacre. In 2013, he took a production of Coriolanus to the Edinburgh Festival, which saw, in Andrew Dixon's words, a cast of nearly 100 extras dressed in druidic robes like something out of Lord of the Rings. The show was accompanied by 2 on-stage heavy metal bands and made the productions he'd seen in Germany look bashful. Although so-called authentic Shakespeares or Chinese opera Shakespeares represent 2 popular presentations of adaptation, the popularity of Lin and the consistent willingness of huge stars to appear in his Shakespeare productions reflects the variations in performance that modern audiences will accept. I want to look at how the stories are changed to fit local sensibilities. One example is A Time to Love from 2005, which changes the ending of Romeo and Juliet so that neither of the characters die. Instead, they get married, but the expressions on their faces in the wedding photo show their worry and insecurity about their future and alienation. The most important idea here is that dying for your beloved is out of the question in present-day Chinese society. Even in present-day Chinese and Japanese society, Western globalization appears as something to challenge and defeat. To transform Shakespeare's high tragedy for a popular adaptation targeted at young audiences is political, as it demystifies Shakespeare and shows a struggle between received cultural authority and local traditions. Rosa Garcia Periago notes a 1930 silent film adaptation of Romeo and Juliet called Love Blossoms from Bloodshed, which also edits a happy ending so that the rivalry between the families ended with the wedding of the Romeo and Juliet characters, showing that this struggle has existed for a huge part of China's history with Shakespeare. The first Chinese film based on Hamlet was released in 2006, directed by Feng Xiaogun, set in the 10th century. As the poster indicates, this adaptation banked on the success of the martial arts film Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. It is an interesting Shakespeare adaptation because the characters don't really stay within the confines of their Hamlet origins. The film is more of a melting pot of Shakespeare's plays. At times, the Hamlet character references Prince Hal from the Henriade. Claudius references tyrannical rulers Richard II, Henry IV, and Richard III. The Ophelia character also parallels Cordelia before fusing into Desdemona. As the poster implies, the Gertrude character is given greater importance in this adaptation, shifting into the role of the main character. In fact, this Gertrude is more reminiscent of Lady Macbeth from the start, with her ambition for power and ruthless strategies to reach it. Her character is granted sympathy and additional screen time due to the added Romeo and Juliet storyline between her and the Hamlet character, her stepson in this version. This is in addition to his typical romance with Ophelia. However, this Juliet does not kill herself after her Romeo dies while saving her life. Instead, she declares herself Her Majesty the Emperor in a move that goes beyond the dimensions of possibility for the original Gertrude. The scholar Ling Wei Yan argues that the ambitious role has been created to give the actress more time and more room for performance, due to Zhang Ziyi's stardom, that is, the actress playing the Empress. Promotional materials for the film heavily utilised the image of Zhang, who was already known for Memoirs of a Geisha and provided a global currency for the film. The director made an interesting statement on her casting. He said, "If I tell European and American vendors that I would relate a Chinese story taking place in the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms era, my translator wouldn't know how to translate. But if I say this is an Asian version of Hamlet starred by Zhang Ziyi, they will get it." In addition to her performance, Zhang will be helpful to the film's distribution. Knowing it is performed by her, big film vendors from all over the world will contact you actively for a view. This highlights not only the perceived value of Zhang's appearance, but the use of Shakespeare as a kind of cultural translator to bring Chinese history to an international audience. Fung puts his finger on the reason many adapters choose to employ Shakespeare here, which kind of leads me into asking what Shakespeare means today. In 2014, the Royal Shakespeare Company announced a £1.5 million government-backed initiative to commission a new Mandarin translation of the complete works, along with a number of Chinese plays into English. This was a part of David Cameron's deals with the Chinese government in December 2013, reflecting culture's role in politics. 2016 marked the worldwide commemoration of the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. It also marked the 400th anniversary of the death of Tang Shanxu, a famous playwright of the Ming Dynasty. In 2017, a statue of Tang and Shakespeare was unveiled in Stratford-upon-Avon. The comparisons continued so that in 2019 a peony pavilion was erected in Stratford-upon-Avon, referencing Tang's best-known play, with plans to recreate Shakespeare's birthplace in Tang's hometown. Here then we see Shakespeare being used as a vehicle for two-way transculturation, for China to not only import Shakespeare but also export its own literature. Having said that, a 2014 British Council survey pronounced Shakespeare one of the 5 British icons most adored by the Chinese, beating Benedict Cumberbatch and the Queen. The 450th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth gained more attention in China than Britain. China's best-selling current affairs magazine Life Week put Shakespeare on the cover for a commemorative issue featuring long articles on his life, Chinese interpretations of the plays, competing translations and much more. And the National Centre for the Performing Arts held a festival called Salute Shakespeare, which went on for 7 months, hosting touring productions. Another issue of Life Week followed in 2016 for the 400th anniversary of Shakespeare's death. Whether it's because of the history of applying Shakespeare to real-life ideological concerns, or because he was denied to people for so many years, Shakespeare is incredibly popular in China today. Thank you for watching. If you're interested in censorship, I would very much recommend Andrew Dixon's book, because that man is obsessed with it. Like, he will be talking to a world expert on Shakespeare and say, "Yeah, but what are you allowed to say?" Also, I barely scraped the surface of Alexa Joubon's research, and she's a premier scholar of Chinese Shakespeares. I'll link the performances that are available online down below. Thanks again.